Okay, everyone, welcome to another Bay Area NLP. This evening, it is my delight to introduce Gretchen Mcculloch, who is an internet linguist. She explores the language of the internet for people of the internet. She's a co-creator and co-host of Lingthusiasm, which is my personal favorite podcast. The author of New York Times bestselling book, Because Internet, Understanding the New Rules of Language. And co-founder of LingCom, the International Conference on Linguistics Communication.
Hello. Yes. All right. Thank you for having me. And this is a fun to get to do a talk from someone else's computer rather than my computer, even though we couldn't do things in person. So I'm really excited to be talking about this. I want to talk about taking playfulness seriously, playful uses of language, and the very real technical problems that shouldn't be seen as problems. It should be seen as entirely legitimate use cases that we're just not quite paying enough attention to from a technical perspective. But let's back up for a second. And I guess before I get into the full talk, this is a version of a talk that I also gave for the Unicode Consortium. So I'm addressing various kinds of sort of tech internal audiences here when it comes to what are the types of tools we're making and how do they support or at least not actively reject playfulness. But let's start with a big question. Let's start with this idea of what is language? What do we mean when we talk about different types of things that can be language? And we often think about language, talk about language in terms of a dichotomy between a written language and a spoken language, where the written side is formal, the spoken side is informal, and sort of never the twain shall meet. But this actually conflates two separate things, in addition to entirely ignoring sign languages, but generally dichotomies do. First of all, is all speech really something that's informal? I'm giving a talk right now. I don't go home and talk to my dog like I'm giving a talk. For one thing, dogs are colorblind, and so it's really hard to design PowerPoints for them effectively. And for a second thing, I don't actually have a dog. And the second question that this brings up is all writing really formal? And I'm going to say, what if we split up these properties of formality and format and ask ourselves what else we can put in these other spaces, and what does this lead to when it comes to reasoning about language and what language can be? And so for one thing, we have a spot for formal speech, which is like the kind I'm doing right now. I'm giving a talk that I have prepared and practiced and so forth. And then in this informal writing slot, we have things like chat, texting, the language that people are posting on social media, and sending in messages to each other. And informal writing is things like key smash. So it's very clearly a written feature because you can't really pronounce it. I guess technically I can, because, Ascii is something that, my linguistics training prepared me very well to be able to articulate random strings of somewhat nonsense sounds or unexpected sounds. Apparently this is people's favorite part of the Because Internet audiobook, so I try to do this parlor trick wherever I can. But the whole point is that something like key smash is written down, and it takes advantage of the characteristics of the written medium and actually reflects what's going on in different types of written mediums. So that first line of key smash is a full-size QWERTY keyboard home row key smash. And that second key smash is again a QWERTY keyboard, but it's a mobile key smash because it's done with the thumbs from the middle. And I've been heard from people who used Dvorak keyboards saying that they either don't key smash at all, they explicitly type out ASDF to try to make a key smash look more like a key smash. They have a copy paste sequence of key smash that they just use, that they have in autocorrect, and various other types of reasons, because if you actually type key smash on a Dvorak keyboard where your home row is all vowels, it looks socially illegible, and people don't recognize it as key smash and doesn't actually accomplish what you want it to. And so even when we're being away on the keyboard, we're being social monkeys. We're never going to produce the works of Shakespeare because the keyboard isn't set up for us to actually do that. And the keyboard is instead set up for us to produce or and yet, so key smash, however, is surely not formal. Nobody thinks of key smash as formal. And so informal writing, the stuff that takes advantage of both the written medium and the informal medium, is the part that I'm very excited about, that I wrote a book about, and that I'm going to keep talking about in this talk, because I think we can get a lot of interesting things out of that. And the first place to start is that informal writing isn't only an internet phenomenon. And in fact, thinking about social writing as informal writing lets us find historical precedents, things like postcards, things like diaries, sketches, notes that you might have taken in a classroom or to yourself, grocery list. And sometimes these involve small drawings intermixed with text. So, spoiler alert, there are emoji eventually. And like all good dichotomies, formality is actually a continuum. This is part of, there are things that are a range of formality, but traditionally speaking, technological products, things that we make to facilitate people's use of language, the Unicode Consortium, other types of things like that, have been concerned primarily with this formal side, looking at formal reference documents like dictionaries, grammars, technical materials, other types of published materials in order to decide what to encode, what to add to that standard. And since that formal side is already really well documented, we're going to instead explore the informal side of the spectrum in this talk. We're also going to talk about the writing side, and this really is a dichotomy where speech and sign are mediated by the human body and the airwaves that you see them across, and sometimes technologies like microphones and video calls and other types of connections, which sort of record the thing as it's being produced. But they don't require external tools in order to make them. Writing requires external tools. Even if you're like, oh, I'm going to write in my own veins, I'm going to take the blood of my veins and I'm going to write it, you have to make your blood external, in a rather gruesome metaphor, in order to write out of the body. If you're going to tattoo yourself with some writing, you're taking something that's external and injecting that into the body. So writing requires external tools, and writing itself is a technology. It's a very old technology. It's a technology that is invisibilized to us because we encounter it so early, we learn about it so early, and because it sort of hides in all of the various tools we can use to do it. But writing itself is a technology. And there's a couple ways that plays out. Writing, for one thing, is influenced by what things are easy and what things are hard, and changes depending on particular tools. So there are lots of commonalities with how spoken languages and signed languages change in response to the pressures of what's easy and hard for the human vocal tract, what's easy and hard for the human hands and arms and face. But we all have the same meat clarinet as humans. We're all producing things from the same type of bodies. That's not true for writing. Writing tools can vary really drastically. And the sort of classic fun example of this is Cuneiform, which is written on these little, clay tablets. Or if you're a modern blogger, there's also this really great cuneiform gingerbread. So you can think of something that's about the consistency of gingerbread, and you can stamp things in with these stylus tools. The modern day gingerbread example uses the squared off corner of like a delivery chopstick to stamp in all of those little triangles. And the symbols are composed of triangles because those are easy to make. Similarly, if you can call this similar, here's an example of somebody scratching in writing. I don't know why it says Usher forever. I was just looking for things that were scratched into hard surfaces. I have no particular stance on Usher or the lack or his everness. But the interesting thing about this particular statement is that it's got look at that R, look at that S. Those are squared off, because it's much easier to scrape lines than to scrape curves. And conversely, in the medieval manuscript on the other side, it's much easier to paint curves than to get your lines super straight. It's easier to paint, to draw with ink certain types of shapes as well. And in a manuscript that's being done by hand, it's basically as easy to make pictures as it is to make text. This sort of distinction between the distinction between pictures and text is something that's created by the printing press, which makes text way easier to produce than pictures, and so makes texts that are predominantly composed of text rather than a combination thereof way easier and cheaper to produce and way more common. And even something like the pen. So, you have a lot of media stories about, the kids, they're not learning how to write by hand in school anymore. They're not learning cursive. The demise of cursive has been a long and slow demise that was initially caused actually by the ballpoint pen. So has anybody here, I guess I can't do a straw poll, but if you think, has anybody here written with an ink pen, like a fountain pen or a quill pen? I can't do it because I'm left-handed and the ink just smudges across the page. And it's way too smudgy. Like I really feel for left-handed people who were trying to do this back in the day. And one of the key innovations in technology for the development of the ballpoint pen, because the early ballpoint pens would leak all over your clothing, you put them in a pocket and they would just leak. They decided to make the ink thicker. And that enables it to not come out behind the little ball as much. And that means that the type of pressure and the type of stroke you need to make and the likelihood of that thin ink to just sort of keep joining automatically because it's inefficient to lift your pen from the page. With a ballpoint pen, the most efficient way of writing is, as you may have discovered for yourself, if you did a lot of handwriting with a ballpoint pen, this sort of half-linked, half-cursive, semi-joined script that a lot of us fall into when we have to write a lot with a ballpoint pen. So the pressure of technology on what writing looks for isn't a new thing that happens with computers or the internet. It's a thing that's always been inextricably part of what writing is. And in particular, on computers, it's easier in certain senses to pick new symbols from the character menu, the character picker, and use them and repurpose them for certain purposes. And they're treated as having the same status as text. Whereas if you draw something yourself, if you want to pick your own arrow, if you want to draw your own shape, that's not given the same status as something you can pick from a character. So on the one hand, the character picker potentially gives you access to a bunch of symbols that it might not have occurred to you to make. So you have this, sideways S symbol. That might be fun. What could you do with that? You can sort of repurpose existing things that have been encoded. But conversely, if you want to draw something, you still need to sort of, get yourself a touchscreen somewhere, which not all devices do. And then it's going to have the status of an image rather than the status of text. So it's going to be sort of a second-class citizen in the world of people being able to forward it and copy and paste it and send it to each other. So all of these things come into play when we think of what constitutes playful or informal writing, and how is that shaped by what's easy and what's hard. So writing is also an invention. It was invented by specific people for specific context, and it was invented only a handful of times around the world. So this map is a bit over, it states a bunch of different old writing systems, but some of them were already influencing each other. There were about 3 to 4 times that writing was invented independently. There was the Mesoamerican script, which became things like the Mayan hieroglyphs and the Zapotec Mixtec script. There was in ancient China and the Oracle bone script, and in Mesopotamia in the Middle East, where you have your cuneiforms, your Hittite hieroglyphs and things like that. And it's not quite clear whether the Egyptian hieroglyphs were borrowed from Mesopotamia or invented separately. We don't have a lot of written records of this time because we didn't have a lot of writing. So I want to shift gears a bit and talk about the informal language sense and how that fits into the writing bit. And there are a few characteristics that informal language has that show up interestingly when you think about the written version of that. So one of those things is that informal language is expressive. People want to be able to express certain types of things, especially their attitudes and their reactions and their emotions and their intentions and towards what they're saying. So this is a chart which is by no means a complete chart of various ways to laugh online in different languages. I particularly like the 5 in Thai, which is pronounced ha, I understand. And so you can put 555 if you want to communicate ha ha ha. There's sort of various ways of sort of pronouncing these depending on what the languages sound like. But this is clearly a thing that lots of different groups of people prioritize doing in ways that are socially intelligible to their local contexts. This is wanting to laugh online is not an obscure or use case, and it's not something that should be treated as unanticipated. This is by now, these examples are from an Atlantic article which cites a Reddit thread from 2012. This is really old. Like, this is not an unanticipated use case. And yet, this prioritization of attitude and expression is not how we're taught to write book reports or academic papers or even news stories or other types of formal genres that go through editing. Formal language is disembodied. It removes the attitudes and even the identity sometimes of the writer, which is fine for some purposes. I mean, formal speech in many cases are similar. I am displaying currently a narrow emotional range. I mean, maybe you're laughing at my tremendously excellent jokes, but like, I'm not laughing because this is a talk. And if you watch a news anchor, the news anchor is not, hopefully, probably laughing. Sometimes those bits make the news when news anchor is laughing because it's so different from how a news anchor normally behaves. And so it's fine that some genres don't reflect the attitudes of the speaker or the writer or the signer or the person who's saying the thing. But informality, that's a genre that does. And so it's not the only way that writing can be. I do want to say that modern people aren't necessarily the only people who prioritize attitude. These are just a few of the many delightful medieval manuscript images that can be found on the internet, displaying things like bunnies jousting on snails. You know, so people have been weird for a long time. Again, weirdness, not an unanticipated use case. But all of these things that are part of writing and informality are ways of prioritizing writing in ways that very precisely indicate how you're saying something personally. Whether that's, you know, respelling words to indicate exactly what your version is, what your vernacular is. And part of taking playfulness seriously is taking people's desire to write their vernacular as a legitimate and understandable and anticipatable desire. It's not strange that people want to be individual and not do necessarily the standardized thing. So there's a couple different ways that this desire to write the vernacular shows up. That desire to be flexible with language, to make what you write correspond more closely to what's in your head and what's in your community than to what's in a style book or an external authority. So you have examples like something like hey, where hey is a word with 1 Y that you would find in an English dictionary. And yet hey with 4 Ys is casual. It's, you know, expressing a certain type of tone of voice. It's expressing a certain type of attitude on the part of the speaker. That's something that you're not going to get support with if you're trying to type that on your phone. Your phone's like, surely you just wanted hey with 1 Y. No, but there's a reason why people want different versions of things. And all sorts of other respellings to communicate, yeah, this is a word that the dictionary itself might recognize, but I want to do a version of it that's playful. Then you have things like minoritized dialects that aren't typically well represented in spell check type tools, in predicted text, things like, so I'm as an example from African American English, like Arabic is a massive case of this where, you know, okay, we've got tools that support Fusha, that support modern standard Arabic, but there's all these local varieties that are well established, that have been around for a long time, that are well known in some senses, but that are harder to write on devices that don't have the same type of cross-device support. And then writing minoritized languages that don't necessarily have a dictionary that's made for this language at all, but like the people in this village, the people on this island or this mountain or this place speak this language and want to be able to say things the way their grandparents would have said them, or say things to their family, to their friends in this sort of area. All of these are these sort of use cases that aren't typically well supported by existing linguistic tools online are all part of this sort of desire to want to do things. The second thing that's interesting about informal language is that it's embodied. It pays attention to things that we can typically communicate with the body beyond the individual words. So this is the category where we talk about emoji, but I don't want to call this category strictly emotional, despite the name. And the reason for that is, so, here's a smiley face. We've all seen the smiley face. Smiley face is happy, right? That's what a smiley face communicates. Well, then you get examples like, I feel sick and tired all the time. So this is from a paper by Dresner and Herring, which is a great paper that sort of anticipates the function of emoji before they were even popular in the West. And it's an example from an online message board where this was for people who had a particular chronic illness, and one of them was saying, I feel sick and tired all the time, happy face. So clearly, this person isn't happy that they're feeling sick and tired all the time. They're using that smiley face for some other means, for some other function, for some other purpose. In this case, maybe it's because they don't want to be seen as if they're complaining that much, that maybe they're trying to soften what they're saying. They're trying to communicate an intention that goes beyond the literal words that they're saying. And so emoji don't quite work if we think of them as like, okay, this communicates the exact emotion this person is probably feeling. But if we think about them as cues towards intention, we can start reasoning about, okay, well, what else is there in the communicative repertoire that can function as cues to intention? So these are some messages that you could send to people. You could say, and you can send them, either in text, or you could send them in speech. You could say, good job. You could say, good job. Say, good job. You could say, good job. Welcome to my talk. I've now flipped everybody off. This clearly has a meta message that is communicating something beyond just the literal words it accompanies. And even emoji that don't have direct hand or face equivalents, even though the hand and face emoji are the most popular emoji, but emoji that don't have direct hand and face equivalents, your heart or sort of good job, jazz hands, good job, sparkle. Sparkle is now used passive aggressively as well, so it's got a lot of stuff, can provide clues towards intention and can provide clues towards the context in which something is trying to be interpreted. This is a workplace setting, so we're not going to talk about the last one. So this is why I like to talk about emoji in terms of gesture, because gestures also provide, in many contexts, clues towards the intention, the context in which something is trying to be interpreted. And and you can get this from a whole range of, from your playful gestures, which are sort of, in the charades family of you're explicitly playing a game, all the way to, okay, this is providing context in which stuff can be interpreted, sort of the difference between saying good job and good job. And the other thing that gestures give us is a way to think about how universal are emoji really. So here are some gestures. And, here's your, fun guess. I can't quite pull the crowd, but guess which of these gestures are obscene in some places. And the answer, fun fact, is all of them. So the middle finger, I think we've covered already. Thumbs up is obscene in many Arabic-speaking countries. The OK sign is obscene in many Latin American countries. And the peace sign, not as a peace sign, but if you turn it around and you're in the UK or Australia or New Zealand, and you do this to someone in traffic, they will understand the obscenity of your intention. And so the thing that I find interesting about this sort of cross-cultural obscenity, despite, there's a certain level of amusement in being obscene in a formal talk, but the thing that I find also interesting about it is that it illustrates how gestures can cross barriers or present barriers that are not necessarily reflective of the languages they accompany. So you have two English-speaking environments if you're in North America, versus if you're in the UK or Australia, you can have a different interpretation of this backwards peace sign, even though you're both speaking ostensibly the same language. But similarly, you can have the middle finger which was known as an obscene gesture to the Romans. So they called it the digitus imputicus. And if Cicero showed up, in this Zoom call, then he would also be offended if you did that to him. So that's useful information for the stranded time traveler. But it also sort of illustrates why it's important to think about these as not strictly universal, but as culturally bound, just not quite culturally bound the same way languages. And another example of this is how emoji are stylized in particular sorts of ways that are also culturally bound. So they don't necessarily, they're not necessarily following the same boundaries as language. They're not universal either. So faces, in Western cartoons and in Western emoticons, like on the blue hand side, the mouth is the important part of the face and the eyes can be the same. So we have a happy face and a sad face, same eyes, different mouths. In Japanese manga and anime, the eyes are the important part and the mouth can be the same. So again, we have a happy face and a sad face in that order, where the happy eyes, as compared to the sad eyes with the tears streaming from them, can go along with the same mouth, or sometimes even no mouth at all, to communicate this sort of message. But if you're Russian, you can also use just the close parenthesis to communicate happiness with no eyes at all. So only eyes or only mouth is in some context sufficient to communicate a particular emotion. And then if you're Apple a few years ago, you can potentially run into problems when the mouth says one thing, like here, this looks like a grimace mouth if you're an English speaker, and the eyes are saying that it's happy. And so people are engaged in confusion about this particular emoji, which was subsequently redesigned, I think, for a relatively good reason. And one of the things about taking playfulness seriously, which has been getting more and more effective in terms of emoji, is that we can, if we analyze the role that cute little pictures are filling within our communication. So this is a graph that I made from Unicode's emoji popularity by category data that was released in the end of 2019, which I wrote about for Wired as well. There's there'll be a link to this later. If you want the full graph, is the popular emoji by category are things like hearts, faces, gestures, oddly plants, which are often used symbolically, more so than, okay, here's just a random image, here's an object that's sort of a noun in the middle of something. It's the stuff that can more readily be used in communicating intentions and communicating that additional type of context. And thinking about emoji in terms of intention can also give us some useful guidelines or context for subsequent emoji release. So future emoji, these are upcoming emoji that'll be out in Unicode 14, where you have things like the melting face, the face with peeking eye, the face with open hands and hand over mouth, the dotted line face, which I can't display myself personally, the face holding back tears. And these were inspired by artistic representations of faces in things like cartoons and manga and anime, and also gestures that hadn't been encoded yet. So that can give us places to look in terms of the research for what's useful to potentially add. I will say that Neil Cohen who's a linguist who researches visual language and symbology, has been looking at specifically, how could you encode specific things that are useful from other sources of stylized, conventionalized images that communicate particular types of things. So this is sort of a success story in taking playfulness seriously. Emoji look really silly, but if you think about, okay, but they're trying to express something important, that's intention, that's gesture. Where can we go to look for other types of gestures to fill in the sort of typological space and try to take seriously what the prospect is that people are actually trying to do? Now we'll get into the fails portion of the evening. So informal language is also contextual. People, formal language is also contextual, but informal language is especially contextual. People communicate meaning by paying attention to context. And so for this, I want to talk about the almost 500-year-old quest for irony-based punctuation. So there have been, ever since 1575, which is the first irony punctuation, at least in Keith Houston's book, Shady Characters, which documents the history of some of this. There have been proposals for, it's really hard to communicate sarcasm in writing. If only this was possible. My friends keep misinterpreting my sarcasm in my letters to them. I proposed this character. You have a couple people proposing backwards question marks, upside down exclamation marks. Rousseau has a proposal, which he called the point d'ironie. Doesn't say what punctuation mark he wanted, unfortunately. And then there's this last one, which is not the real Sark mark, because the real Sark mark costs $1.99. And I just don't think my friends are going to pay $1.99 so they can tell that I'm being sarcastic at them. I think you're going to potentially run into problems there. And what these proposals miss, what all of them miss, saying, well, if only we had a punctuation mark, and then people would know unambiguously that I was trying to be sarcastic. And the problem is that we actually have a tool for being completely lucid already. And that tool is called not being sarcastic. This is possible. And so why is it that people choose to be sarcastic, even when they know they choose to be ironic, they choose to be even passive aggressive, they choose to communicate with double meaning, when they know that if they communicated only with a single meaning, that meaning would be much more likely to be received? And it's because if you look at the irony literature, even your sort of gold standard, face-to-face, full communications channel irony still comes in two parts. There's the part where you say the irony, the ironist communicates the ironist, and then the recipient, who you could call perhaps the irony, indicates their comprehension of the ironic statement. So you never know that you've communicated your ironies completely successfully until the other person makes the reaction apparent that they have or have not received your irony. And this is important because this is why we do irony, because if someone can misinterpret you, then if they do actually interpret you correctly, you've shown that you're on the same page, you've gained something. You've arrived at some level of understanding. You've taken the risk and you've seen the rewards from that. Irony contains risk inherently. And so what internet people have done with respect to communicating irony is having a whole bunch of potential punctuation marks and strategies, all of which have a sincere double meaning, not just because this is an example of this sort of creative repurposement of existing punctuation, although it is that too, but because you can use, for example, quotation marks to indicate, like, here's a quote that I'm attributing to someone, which is a mark of authority or sincerity. But then if you use quotation marks in a certain context, people know that this can't have been a real quote, because who does that? And so you end up with something like a scare quote or something like a quote that's being used ironically. And sort of the same thing all the way down, you can use ironic capitalization, but you can also use capitalization sincerely, and so on and so forth. So the mistake in some senses that these early proposers did, your Rousseaus and so on, was in being too simplistic in their analysis of irony and wanting to make it too easy on the reader. So this one is sort of a question of interpretation, but characters meaning different things in different contexts is not some sort of weird feature of irony or some weird feature of the internet. Characters meaning different things in different contexts is literally why we have characters that are combinable rather than just producing our entire sentence as one undistinguished blob that we blob into someone else's brain. The fact that we have lots of different bits that do different things in different contexts is what makes us able to produce an infinite set of words out of a finite set of 26 letters or however many characters your writing system has, which is still more or less finite. And technological tools, to a large extent, at least in formal contexts, do correctly interpret characters meaning different things in different contexts. A text-to-speech reads the C in car differently from how it reads the C in city, which it's supposed to. Your browser is parsing, Excel is parsing a dot in something that looks like it's a URL different from a dot in something that looks like it's a fraction when it doesn't mess up. You know, you're reading 2 as in 12 and 2 as in 20 differently when you're doing calculations. You're displaying F and I differently when they're by themselves than when they're in a ligature. Trust me, that character is actually a ligature. The spacing is slightly different. I went and got it. But you know, sometimes it really overlaps when you're not using Helvetica. And you're interpreting, you know, the double dot, which again, I promise this is actually a real umlaut, as an umlaut versus as a diaeresis, in a word like über versus in a word like naive. It's just weird to me that here are all these contexts in which we know we have to make multiple meaning and multiple display work. It's weird to me that colon in its punctuation use and colon in its smiley use is not also on this list. Because, like, as I'm going to say a few times in this talk, like, the smiley in the colon with this makes a smiley has been around since the 1980s. This is not like a new weird thing that people are suddenly doing. This is like older than some of the people in this talk. I hope so. So this is what happens when you're a font designer and you forget that smileys exist. This is Twitter's chirp font a few weeks ago. And you forget that smileys exist, and you put some, hey, what if we put the colon on the baseline rather than putting it in the middle of the line? That would look cool, right? Nothing could possibly go wrong that our users might want to type on our social media website, because we've forgotten that smileys exist. And you have to retro-engineer stuff like this, where if you see this, this is the colon doing a cute little hop when you type a parenthesis after it, because Twitter had to later retroactively go in and be like, haha, oops, smileys, we'll make your smileys look okay. It's just that they like only did it for some smileys, because again, who would have ever anticipated that users might like create their own smileys? And like, here are a few common smileys, and we're going to do it for them and make them look okay. But we're not going to do it for the entire, like, this would have been avoided if you had just said, oh, when we're designing a font, we should make sure it actually looks okay as a smiley, because that's a thing we can definitely anticipate that users are going to do on Twitter. And the same thing in some senses go for Calmoji, which have also, so that's the horizontal smiling faces, which have also been around since the 1980s. I think they're around like only 2 years in age difference between that and the flipped, vertical emoticon. And yet they're not being treated, and Unicode has standards to do this. As I went to a talk recently at the Unicode Consortium about somebody telling me about all the ways you could do this. You can define certain types of strings to treat as single words for line break purposes or for text selection purposes, such that when you try to grab it, your cursor will grab them all together. Or when you go to a new line, it'll break them all together. This is not what's happening for Calmoji, even extremely mainstream Calmoji like the Shruggy. And this is, to some extent a frivolous problem, but it is a problem that I ran into when we were just typesetting because internet. So people are including playful characters in relatively formal contexts, but that shouldn't be a requirement to take playfulness seriously, because what's also happening is that many users are just using these all the time and being quietly frustrated. And this makes you want to flip tables. So this brings us to Ascii Art. Again, it shouldn't necessarily be a requirement that something is super old just to support it. But I think it does help make the case that this isn't some sort of like obscure and unanticipated use case. Because if something just started last week, I think you can make a much more justifiable statement. They say, oh, well, we're not supporting it because people only started doing it last week. Ascii Art, depending on how you want to measure it, you could say Ascii Art got started around 1966. That's what Wikipedia says, which is approximately 3 years after the ASCII standard was introduced. So there has definitely been an ASCII plus art, much longer than there has been an ASCII without art. You could say that it became popular in the 70s and 80s on bulletin boards, which is definitely older than some of the people in this talk. If you want to count typewriter art, you could say that it got started in the 1800s, which I am 100% sure is older than everybody in this talk. So again, it's not unanticipated that people might want to use punctuation characters to make rudimentary images. And yet when you get a screen reader that tries to support something like this, it reads it out as things like, open parenthesis, close parenthesis, close parenthesis, open parenthesis, close parenthesis, underscore, 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 underscore. I'm doing this wrong because I am more bored than a screen reader gets. The screen reader does not get bored, and it will say all of those underscores to you. And this is weird. This is suboptimal from the user perspective. And do you know what would be fairly trivial to do if you're a computer? It would be to count things, such as, for example, if you have a whole bunch of underscores all in a row, maybe instead of saying underscore, 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 you could count how many underscores you have. Computers, they're good at counting things. You don't need machine learning for this shit. You could just count them and say 5 underscores. And that would be slightly less painful for the user than hearing underscore, 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 even more if there's 12 of them. And possibly you could even be looking at things like, okay, if other people have used this meme, what have they been trying to do with it? And could we convey, if somebody annotated this somewhere that says, this is a coffee cup, or this is a teacup, I guess. So I'm going to break my own rule here, which is, my own rule is never do multimedia in a presentation because it always breaks. Because you need to witness how excruciating it is when people use special characters for artistic purposes, for creative purposes, for playful purposes, and people have to witness this in the screen reader. This is not my example.
Edit text. U. Mathematical sans serif italic small t. Mathematical sans serif italic small h. Mathematical sans serif italic small 1. Mathematical sans serif italic small n. Mathematical sans serif italic small k. It's. Mathematical script small c. Mathematical script small u. Mathematical script small t. E2. Mathematical sans serif bold small d. Mathematical sans serif bold small r. Mathematical sans serif bold small 1. Mathematical sans serif bold small t. Mathematical sans serif bold small a. Your tweets and usernames. Mathematical bold fractor small t. Mathematical bold fractor small h. Mathematical bold fractor small 1. Mathematical bold fractor small s. Mathematical bold fractor small d.
Okay, I'll put you out of your misery. But this is only half of it. These are painful. This is the same thing that happens with the underscore, underscore, underscore bit. And current workarounds for this problem are bad. In a technical sense, what I would call them is bad. So current suggestions for what to do when screen readers don't cope well with text-based memes are either don't participate in the meme, which is less fun, take a screenshot of the ASCII-based image you want to post, and then post it as an image instead with alt text, which is less terrible for screen readers in the short term, because you can say something like, this is an ASCII image of a teacup, and here's the message that I put in it. But it loses all of the benefits of having text. Copy pastability, searchability, editability, the remixability that makes these memes popular in the first place is because you can copy paste the plain text and you can tweak it a little bit and you can do your own version of them. That's what makes them popular. And so the whole point of why encoding exists and why we're not texting by sending photos of handwritten text to each other is because there are lots of benefits to having text. And again, here are some cute math mode texts, which I won't make you listen to this time, but how hard would it really be to normalize them to say, okay, either maybe the user wants to toggle between math mode where you actually read out what each character is in case you're trying to do math with them, or between, meme mode where you're not. These could be normalized to sound perfectly fine. They're just not yet. And so, again, this is a version of a talk I gave to the Unicode Consortium, and so I think is especially relevant here. But any of us who interact regularly with technology tend to be sort of Unicode fans. So Unicode, it's great. This device has full Unicode support. Yeah, that's what I want. Nobody likes seeing tofu and seeing here's some characters that don't display because the Unicode's broken, it hasn't been updated. But when somebody's advice for here's how you can make your text more legible is avoid Unicode. And, this isn't, strictly speaking, avoid all Unicode characters, because of course an underscore is still in Unicode, or AND, all of those characters are also in Unicode, but especially, avoid creative use of special characters, which is what this is saying. That's not great. Something's gone wrong, and it wouldn't actually even be particularly hard to fix. So this shows up at other places. These are screen caps from the draft ebook edition of Because Internet. You can see that it's broken because I used too many obscure symbols. Like, don't know why that bit of text is bigger, shouldn't be. The obscure symbols is not supposed to have tofu after it. And in fact, I managed to kind of break the entire Kindle app with my book, which is really hilarious now, but wasn't super hilarious because Internet was coming out. Because what would happen is people who had the like phone app of Kindle would download Because Internet, they'd buy it, they'd download it, and then they'd try to load it, and it would try to load lots of Unicode so it could display some of these obscure symbols, and it would run out of memory. It would run out of font. It would try to load too many fonts. It would run out of memory and it would crash the entire Kindle app. So you couldn't get back, like you couldn't actually get in. And so I had some extremely polite 4-star reviews on Amazon that were like, I'm sure this book is great. However, I can't get into it because it's crashing my app. We ended up trying to solve this by replacing the images with text, which again, there are lots of reasons why text is great. You can copy paste it. When I was going and looking for these screenshots, I was like, oh yes, I'll just go find these by doing a internal text string search for Zalgo and for glitch, and I couldn't find it. And then I was like, oh, that's right, because we encoded these as images, and that means they're not searchable anymore. And of course, in the footnote view, so these two things on the left or on the right are both images from the same footnote, but depending on the view, one of them accidentally gets stretched badly, which again is why you don't want to use images in place of text when you could use text, because the thing is supposed to support text, because there are advantages to using text. So my sort of modest proposal is that platforms actually already have a fairly easy ways of dealing with we call novel linguistic character strings, aka new words, which is that you maintain some sort of a dictionary. You add a new word like COVID to it when it becomes apparent that people are going to be using it, and then you update it. And then when somebody comes across the sequence COVID, rather than reading it like that, you can be like, ah, yes, look, that means COVID because we've established that this is a new word. We have protocols for dealing with new words. Platforms could also deal with novel artistic character strings, aka memes or art, in a similar sort of way by saying, hey, here's the existing set that we support. It's not that many. It's just like adding some text strings to a file. And then when there's a new one, somewhere like Know Your Meme, which extensively documents all of these. So this meme became popular on Twitter on Tuesday last week. And then by Wednesday, the day after, it already had this very detailed explainer on Know Your Meme of exactly what was going on. So this data exists. It's just a question of linking it together. And similarly for this one in particular, you wouldn't even need a specific entry for it because you could literally just, when the exact same character is read multiple times, what if we just said 20 of this name of emoji? Computers, if they're good at one thing, it's literally counting strings of characters. You can do this in regex. You don't need artificial intelligence. So it's, again, I also want to point out that I made a Unicode version of this name. So we could say in response to, hey, you're doing like creative stuff with things. These characters were encoded for important stuff like math and language. Like, stop using them to make art with. Like, it's not our fault that the users keep finding unintended use cases that break the software. Why can't they just be more serious? But I think, first of all, that just don't make art is like both a weird ethical stance, a weird moral stance, and a weird practical stance. When we think back about the legacy that we want to leave on this earth, is we want to stand for like, I'm really proud that I encourage a lot of people to follow the rules and make less art, or make art that some people can't experience because of the format, because we didn't make the format artistic enough, account for art. And even if you think that you could stop and tell people to stop using serious characters for fun games, stop doing this stuff, do we really think we have much of a chance of succeeding at this? So, this is an image of a desire path, which is a classic example of architecture of like, sometimes the users want what they want. And if the users want to go under the trees, the users are going to go under the trees. And this is something that we could support. And this is something that, by and large, many types of technical organizations do support. You're not going to say something like, okay, well, here are all these languages that have different ways that they accomplish justification of characters. Some languages do it with word spacing, with glyph spacing, with lengthening characters. But like, who even cares? Who needs justification anyway? It doesn't matter because the spacing can still be understood if the spacing is ugly. That's not how things generally work for serious content. It's like, no, all of these languages need to be typeset correctly. All of these languages need to display correctly. This needs to be possible. And I want to say that being creative and playful and fun and making memes of things is part of the human condition and should be an anticipated use case. So, one example is like we already use BCP tags to encode things like Canadian English, Latin American Spanish, Arabic language content using basic Latin digits instead of Arabic script digits. Like you can do a lot of stuff with this. And often these are auto-detected rather than making the user specify them because users won't and shouldn't have to. I think it'd be fairly trivial to try to auto-detect playfulness or meme uses, such as identifying strings of all of the same character, which isn't normally what language looks like, and tag them with something like meme, en fun, en art. Maybe this is somewhere we could end up. So if we go back to our question from the beginning of what is language, I decided to try to answer this in true internet fashion. I consulted the Oracle of the Human Id, the stock photo website. So what the internet says the English language is books. There's a couple of blackboards, whiteboards, some glasses to read the books with, but mostly books. There's also a couple incredibly disturbing stock photos with flags painted on tongues, which I refuse to dignify by paying for the rights to, so you're getting this watermarked version. Seriously, there are so many of these. I'm not buying this one either. Okay, so let's wash that from our brains and get back to books. But the idea of language as a book, or as a sufficiently large quantity of books, isn't a fact so much as a metaphor. And the idea of talking about the English language as a thing dates back only to the mid-late 18th century. This is Samuel Johnson's dictionary, which came out in 1755. And this idea that you could sort of classify and catalog and fit language or English into a book or some number of books is around the same age. And metaphors change. So these are people who were also using steam engines as metaphors for the brain. I think we could really do a new metaphor. So one of the biggest influences that the internet could have on language isn't just as, people can share things with each other, which, despite how cool that is, but it's also as a new metaphor. Language is like the internet. Language is a network. It's a web. It's an open source project. It's a participatory democracy. And so when we think about language as a network, we can gain several ways that we can understand language more complexly. So if someone writes in the margins of your book, that's vandalism. That's anti-authoritarian. But when you add more sites to the internet, when you add more links between sites, when you meet new people, when you say a sentence no one's ever said before, or make up a new word, that makes a network better and deeper and richer. When you leave a book on a table, you expect it to look the same the next day. When you leave the internet overnight, you really better not expect to wake up to find that everyone stopped talking without you. And language works like that too. Language keeps changing because it lives in the minds of living and changing human beings. If language had to be transmitted the exact same way from one generation to the next, it would be brittle and fragile. It could be lost the way a technology can be lost, a manuscript can be lost. But we've never met a society without language. If you throw a bunch of kids together without language, they'll reinvent it even if the adults aren't giving it to them. And that's because we recreate language in our minds with every generation. And part of the way we do that recreation is through play, is through creativity, is through art, is through experimentation. So we're thinking about how might users play with this particular linguistic feature? How might users play with this particular interface feature? This needs to be part of our core use case and not some sort of weird exception that, never seems to be designed for, even when it's older than the actual designers. Yeah, thank you very much. There's a link to the slides if you want them.
Right, Gretchen, thank you very much. So that was incredible, and I wish my co-organizer Katie was here tonight, because she works at Twitter and maybe could influence some.
I need somebody who works at Twitter. I also,
if
anybody knows anybody who is working on screen reader platforms, I feel like they're sort of a weird bit of technology, because they're not necessarily as obviously mainstream, but like Twitter is breaking Unicode in several ways, and there are some people at Unicode who would really love to just be super friendly and enthusiastic to somebody who could fix some of them.
I'd be happy to make that intro.
Yes, please.
All right, so like I mentioned on the chat, please ask any questions that you have on the chat, and then I'll call you out to ask live. We are recording. We'll decide afterwards whether or not we want to share. If you're not comfortable being on the screen at all or being recorded, just let me know in the chat, and I will ask the question on your behalf. I know we're a little bit over now, but I think we can spend like 5 minutes on questions. All right. Oh, how did someone get italics work in Zoom chat? That's a skill I don't have.
Taking playfulness seriously,
Yeah.
et cetera, et cetera.
So Lindsay, would you like to jump on video and ask your question?
Yeah, sure. Hi. First of all, thank you. It was a wonderful talk.
Okay, we can see you, but we can't hear you.
Rob, are we both muted so that we're not echoing with each other?
Can you hear me now?
Try again.
Okay.
Yes.
Sorry. Yeah, thank you so much. That was a wonderful talk. As someone who used to do conversation design for chatbots, this was like a huge pain point. Informal language was a huge pain point. I would be combing through text that came through, and the bot would never know what to do with anything that, there'd be an LOL. And I think at some point we tried to tell it that LOL meant sarcasm or something, but people would say things like, oh, we're closing on my home, LOL. And the bot would respond with something totally inappropriate. And so
Yeah.
it was very difficult to like work with informal language. So do you I guess what's being done about it? What have you seen? How far do you think we have to go before tech is actually catching up with this? Because it definitely was like as someone working in tech, I was like, we're not even close to doing anything, but it was a huge problem for us. So just
and I
wanted
think
to
we're talking about like natural language. We have to also be including informal language in that, because natural language is informal. If you're not doing it just from, okay, here's a, one very carefully edited book that all follows the same style guide. I think it's really one of the next frontiers. Where I've seen, useful glimmers of progress has been, so for example, my keyboard on my phone, I can tell it that I have multiple languages that I potentially text in, and it will try to determine which of those that I'm texting in, even though they're using the same alphabet and the same keyboard. It'll try to determine whether I'm texting in French or in English, and it'll try to predict the next word based on what the previous word was and what language that was. And this is context sensitive, and it has gotten a lot better since I started trying to text multilingually about 2014 or so. And that's gotten better. And so I wonder if that type of detection of like, okay, you're in this mode versus that mode could also be done for something like, am I texting in an informal style or am I texting in formal style? Because if I'm texting in an informal style with my friends, sometimes I'm going back and actively deleting the auto capitalization because I want to seem more chill. And so surely if I've gone and deleted 2 auto capitalizations, maybe it shouldn't keep giving me more, because maybe I'm not in caps mode here. Maybe one's an accident, but like if I've been typing the rest of this all in lowercase, why is it still giving me uppercase? And this is, I think this is fairly trivial to detect. But like this is the idea that people might want to type in two languages is taken somewhat seriously. I mean, it's not particularly good at supporting, like, if I want to borrow a French word into English but use English suffixes on it, or vice versa, use English endings, that's going to break it, right? Like, it's not supporting sort of code switching within the same word, which is something that users totally do. But at least it's supporting code switching within the same sentence, which is also something that users do, but that they do between, you know, different types of varieties, not like they do between different types of varieties and registers, not just between two different languages as defined by a standards body like the Académie Française. And also things like users have personal dictionaries on their devices, which try to support what a user has the personal dictionary. Okay, but like, what if you could share like an edited excerpt of your personal dictionary? I mean, and you can now sign in so that you get the same personal dictionary even on your new phone, so you don't have to teach it that you actually do use the word fuck. But like, or, you know, that you have certain names of certain types of things. But like, what if you could say, okay, you know, so language like, I don't know, Egyptian Arabic or something, which doesn't have formal standards, you can't necessarily go and find a dictionary of it. But like, maybe there are enough users that if they were able to share personal dictionaries between them, they'd be able to sort of, you know, crowdsource that or share that. Or like, how can you enable users to communicate to each other better about the types of things they want to do and have the tech facilitate some of that? You know, I saw one of the things that's currently going on that I think is kind of nifty in some places. So depending on which machine translation thing you're doing, it will sometimes manage to detect that. So say there's a word in another language. So say you have like, das ist so schön or something like that. It's probably bad German, but like that zu, the repeated U there, if you're going to machine translate that into like, that is so beautiful, you could take the repeated U and make it into a repeated O, because maybe the users also wants to communicate that repetition. And I've seen some platforms do it and some not, but it's sort of fairly mechanistic to say, if the user repeats a bunch of like a letter in the input word, maybe they want to repeat a letter in the output word, because depending on, I mean, it's easy for me to look at something like zu and be like, oh, there's a U, it's repeated. Like, even if I don't speak German, I'm familiar with the same alphabet. But if you're doing something like, so something that Japanese speakers do, Chinese speakers, and also a few other alphabets that use Latin script, like Tagalog, they'll use a swung dash, which looks like a tilde but wider, or also called a wave dash, to indicate sound repetition for emphatic purposes. So if you have something like hai and you put a tilde after it, a wave dash, that would be the same thing as English writing yes or yeah, repeating one of those letters. So if you know, here's a thing that users are doing informally that indicates a repetition or elongated string, you could either bring that down as a punctuation character, because, you know, there are some Japanese manga and anime fans that use that as a elongated character for stylistic effect, or you could bring down, okay, what this indicates is the same thing as letter repetition in this script. What if we represented it with letter repetition? Because somebody who's not familiar with Japanese doesn't necessarily know that the wave dash is an emphatic punctuation character, rather than just like, this could be a script character in this language. You don't have no way particularly of knowing that. So, you know, like, I think it's not just one fix, right? Because it's not just one thing that comes up, because language has got a whole lot of stuff in it. But looking at and examining and analyzing some of these sort of, it's like thinking about more of these use cases and thinking about them instead of sort of as noise that you need to sort of normalize away from, but as core things that people are consistently going to keep doing, regardless of whether you support them. And like, this is part of the job. It's not normalized. It's not noise to be normalized away from, I guess, is the sort of initial paradigm shift. And then there's a whole bunch of stuff that comes after that.
Yeah, thank you. That's interesting. I guess I kind of have a follow-up, but I don't know,
Yeah.
Rob, if you want me to do a follow-up.
Yeah, go ahead. I think we're almost out of time here, but Nikhil and Stephen, I see your questions. I think Gretchen covered them in the response just now as well. So
Okay.
Go ahead, Lindsay.
I guess I have, like, in that example you share about like the Swahili, and they're putting a little tilde thing like after letters to indicate that
Japanese,
it's elongated. Do you think it's going to be a situation where we're in the tech world, we may have to do some things that are like somewhat prescriptive that users will have to pick up on and then follow. Like, I guess I'm wondering about this balance of like, are we just going to always be trying to catch up with users and language that's always changing? Or do you think for us to really be able to understand informal language online with tech, there's going to have to be some sort of like prescriptive, like you were saying, switch to sarcasm, or like some way to indicate that you're not actually speaking informal English anymore?
I think that the switch, like what if you had a, BCP tag that indicated art mode or something? I don't think that's necessarily prescriptive art mode, right? I think that's, maybe some of it is sort of trying to detect what the user's doing and what they're trying to do. Maybe some of it is like, can you switch your screen reader to like, I know I'm on Twitter, thanks. Or like on these websites, please read stuff as if they're memes. On these other places, if I'm doing something in a math editor, please read it as if it's math. I think that there's, to some extent, there's, can you give users choice? So stuff like I like what Google Translate's doing with, in languages where they don't make a gender distinction in the third person, and it's giving something that could be translated as either, he is a doctor or she is a doctor, rather than sort of just like extract your gender stereotypes from your input text and present people with more gender stereotypes, which is bad. Giving people sort of two options and saying, this one means this one means this, and let the user pick, right, it's, I have enough world knowledge to know, hopefully, or maybe, or at least to know that this is ambiguous, to decide what's going on. But I think that a useful organization to think about in terms of context here is organizations like dictionaries, which are, in fact, actually constantly playing catch up to users. That is what dictionary editors are doing. That's why they keep making new dictionaries, because the language doesn't stop. So there are institutions that like, this is what you do with languages. You are constantly playing catch up to users because there is no finite state that it ends up in. And there is no actual alternative to playing catch up to users. Like that is the only thing that exists, because there's either going out of date and not catching up to them, and then the users move on without you, or there's playing catch up and potentially being only a little bit out of date. It has never existed the state where you just stop users from changing things or doing things. I mean, the only way to get a language, so, a language like Latin, which is sort of in a particular state, but that's because there are no living speakers of Latin in the, organic language sense where it's being passed along to children. I mean, there are a bunch of living speakers of Latin who currently call themselves French speakers and Spanish speakers and Portuguese speakers and Italian speakers and things like that, because that's where it ended up and is continuing to end up with that. So I think I think trying to help users is a place to go, but trying to get users to be more constrained is really just sort of fighting them. And I don't think that's a great experience for anybody.
All right. So my apologies to everyone who had questions. We are at time here. Unfortunately, we have a dinner reservation we have to make around the corner. Otherwise, I would love to be able to talk about this more.
You can. It's also in my book. Some of this is also in the book. Or on the podcast. I talk about this stuff constantly. So feel free to or tweet your questions to me on Twitter, and I can try to get to them later if that's a reasonable format. But if you want a long format answer, really there's a lot in there as well.
Yeah, please do buy the book. Anywhere you can find books online or in person. Go support your local bookstore.
I think I left a signed copy somewhere in the Bay Area, treasure hunt.
Oh, wow. Okay, that'd be valuable. And yeah, so it was a personal delight for me to be at an in-person meetup of the two of us in person.
Good to see you. Physical high five.
Like I said, I hope to do this more in the future as we can meet in person, but we've really enjoyed having people join online, especially people who couldn't be here in person. So we'll certainly try to keep an online component going forward so that you can all continue to join us. So Gretchen, thank you again.
Thank you for having me. This has been fun.
Thanks all. Bye.
Thank you. Goodbye. Thank you so much. This was really awesome to listen to.